Hello, welcome again to the Practical Enneagram. Deborah Ooten is a brilliant systems thinker who was the first Enneagram teacher to combine the Enneagram with spiral dynamics, the model of the evolutionary development of humans. The spiral describes how what we value and our worldviews emerge from the interaction of our life conditions and our mind's capacities. It was discovered by Don Beck and Chris Cowan in the 80s and 90s that we graduate through a predictable sequence of stages with that, with so far 8 stages having been described well. All Enneagram types evolve or don't through these stages because a type is an account of personality and being, which the spiral does not account for. Although our types do, to an extent, determine what we think, feel, and do, they don't explicate on how we think and feel about those things. The spiral does. Deborah's been teaching the spiral and the Enneagram to students of her school, the Conscious Living Centre, for years. Excitingly, Deborah's also about to teach a course for the Shift Network on the Enneagram, spiral dynamics, and Gurdjieff. Hopefully, I will be able to tell you a bit more about that in future episodes. It's not necessary to study the spiral as a regular Enneagram student and if you aren't particularly into systems. However, it is helpful to at least have an awareness of it. It engenders a stretching of your perspective taking. The ability to take perspectives is really the essence of cognitive development. And I think it might be true that cognitive development leads the way in terms of development on all the other lines, including the spiritual. But as ever, I'll leave that for you to decide. Huge thanks again for taking the time for this. I'm excited to speak with you and I'm excited about this topic as well. First question, one that you must have answered, I don't know how many times. What is spiral dynamics? Who tends to use it as well, Deborah, please?
So thanks for having me, by the way, Rez. This is going to be fun. Who uses spiral dynamics? A lot of eggheads use it, basically, is the way I think of it. Basically, spiral dynamics is a system that is charting the evolution of us, of humans, Homo sapiens, for the last 100,000 years, basically. So we start at one level of consciousness and move to another. And two things are paired in spiral dynamics. So one is life conditions, and the other is cognitive capacity. Life conditions are time, circumstances, problems, and place. So, for instance, it's a different time in Cincinnati, Ohio, than it is in Cairo, Egypt, even though it's the same day, but it's different because of what's occurring. Circumstances, problems, place, and time. That's one strand that we're looking at. And that's paired with cognitive capacity, how we think about what it is that we're thinking about. How we think about what we think about is dependent on what level of consciousness we're at. And consciousness here is defined cognitive capacity. It's not defined from a spiritual perspective.
Right. So the spiral maps, I'm about to use the word development, and you corrected me already around this, but is it not a development of our cognitive capacity?
So let's talk about it from evolution, because development has a different meaning for me in terms of, psychology. Also, I think Russ Hudson and Don Riso's work in Wisdom of the Enneagram gives us 9 levels of, health and wholeness, which can appear to be developmental. Whereas I don't believe the spiral is. And instead, it's about, like I said, solving these problems. And so we're looking at the conscious evolution of humanity, basically. It's the evolution. So like the first level of consciousness that we're talking about in the spiral is beige. It took 50,000 years for us to evolve to the next level, which is purple. And then from purple to red, it took 25,000 years. So time accelerates as we move up the spiral, if you will.
I was thinking about, before we move on to what causes change to happen in spiral terms, I was thinking about a goofy metaphor for this. So, say you have a house, would it be accurate to say Enneagram type is like rooms in the house, and these spiral levels are the floors?
That's an okay metaphor. I like that metaphor. In my work, I think you have a copy of it. In my first article, what I do is I take the ontogenetics, which is the development of the individual, and place it on the vertical line. And on the horizontal line. And on the vertical line, I place the spiral, which is the phylogenetics, the development of the species. So you can see each type at each level. The spiral, which is Gravian theory, is giving us information about our evolution, but it's also telling us about what we value. So each each level of consciousness, each way of thinking about things is determined because of our values. And our values determine our beliefs, and our beliefs create our reality. And so that's why we call these V memes. And a V meme is an energy core that kind of radiates commands, instructions, cultural norms, societal norms as well, into each of us, into the minds of each of us. And so those things are there, they're present for us every day, whether they're turned on or not.
Whether they're turned on or not. What do you mean by that, whether they're turned on or not?
Well, I mean, we evolve to a certain level of consciousness. So our cognitive complexity goes from certainty to relativity. So if we're more expanded, people have a tendency to see that as we are more evolved. It's better because they're measuring it from some sort of place that's on the spiral, for instance. And so how we think about what we think about is what the spiral is teaching us. And those thoughts change according to our values. So just real quick, what we value in beige is survival. What we value in purple is animistic thinking. Basically, we see that all things are imbued with spirit. What we value in red is hedonistic, pleasure-driven, non-consequential thinking. To hell with you, basically. I'll do what I want. So you see what we're doing as we go up the spiral. What we value in blue are traditions. Fiddler on the Roof is a great example of tradition. In blue, we get some of our major institutions, politics, financial, so forth and so on. Orange values multiplistic thinking. I can get wherever I'm going. There's a ton of different ways. I'm going to New York next weekend, and I've mapped out about 15 different routes from Cincinnati to New York. So I'll pick one eventually, and we'll go that way. So, and of course, in green, we value a belief that all are welcome here. So we value community. And so then we move into second tier consciousness, and other things are valued there. So you can see that it shifts, and those values that I just highlighted shifts the way we think about stuff. So if we're in blue, we tend to think about things more with certainty. Okay. It's, it's the one way, the true way, as they say in the Catholic Church, the one true apostolic church or something like that. So I know this is the way it is, pretty certain. And as we get to green, yellow, and turquoise, there's not a lot of certainty. Everything is relative.
That will begin to give people not familiar with the spiral an idea of how much this map, or where we are on this map, shapes how we show up in the world. So before we get to pairing spiral with the Enneagram, can you go over briefly what the 3 kinds of change that happen are in spiral terms?
So when we look at change dynamics, there are usually 7 different or 6 or 7 different things that have to be present for change to occur. And change can occur in 3 specific ways. It can be horizontally. So and now we're talking spiral. So if let's say I'm on the blue meme, let's say I live in blue. So I'm not a blue person, like I'm not an 8 or whatever. So, but I live in blue, or I conceptualize primarily from blue. Well, blue is very traditional. And so, you have things like, I usually give an example of, well, in blue, we might say, you only have children in wedlock. And then if if one of your children has a child out of wedlock, your blue expands when you go, well, you know what? This is the church's rule. It's not my rule, because I love you and you're my child and I'm going to love my grandchild, that kind of thing. Right. And so that's the way we might think there. Whereas when we go into orange, we're going to think a little more, like I said, multiplistically. We're going to look at what's the right best way for me, if you will. And so that's the expansion in horizontal. So then we can go up, which is vertical. And that vertical, like from blue, we'll just go from blue to orange. You can see the difference in the way we think, because we start having many options. So you can expand blue and make it wider, like a bigger tent. All are welcome to the bigger tent. Or you can expand vertically, move into another level of consciousness. You can't skip levels. It takes about 7 years to move from one level to the other, if you move at all. Yeah. Like my mother-in-law just died in January in 93, and she never left blue. However, she expanded that consciousness immensely. So she was able to have all kinds of new things pop into her life and still remain dedicated to her Catholicism. Okay.
That's so interesting. Yeah. That's really, sorry, clear. That's clear on the horizontal and the vertical. And then what's the third one?
The third one is oblique. So oblique is like an LSD trip for me. It's sort of like, let's say I'm living in orange and I pop up. So basically I pop up into a higher knowing, a higher consciousness, a more expanded consciousness. And for me, when these things happen, I come back into myself and I'm like, wow, that's interesting. And I write it down. And then I look at it and I'm like, what the hell does this even mean? So oblique means you get, I think of them also as neurosynaptic responses. So you have this leap into another way of thinking, but you can't stay there because it's not where you live. You haven't risen to that level of consciousness. That makes sense?
It totally does. But I'm thinking the trigger for that must be some sort of drug or
yes, that's what I would say. I would say inner work, meditation, of course, is essential. LSD is always helpful, and I'm sure there's other drugs that you can use. But I know there's a lot of wonderful research that's resurfacing regarding what people did with the LSD. But anyway, I don't think a drug is necessary. I think laying in the sun for too long
could bring it on. In a way, it's a less interesting sort of change for me because it's not sustainable, and I'm much more interested in what's sustainable.
It isn't sustainable, but it gives you a window into what's possible. So it's not sustainable in the moment, but it may be like I used to say when I was first teaching it, that the spiral is pulling us and pushing us. So it's like the simultaneous thing. So that oblique experience kind of is like it's a teaser,
Yeah. Can it act like a magnetic pull upward?
Yeah. And I think, when those things have happened to me in the past, I have a tendency to immediately go research whatever it is that I'm, experiencing. And so then that starts to shift my knowing, my cognitive awareness, and it shifts me into the possibility of change, either horizontally, vertically, or obliquely. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So why is it useful to combine the spiral with a map like the Enneagram? Or there isn't really a map like the Enneagram. I'm just going to say the Enneagram because I don't think there's any other map like the Enneagram.
Well, it is the map as far as I'm concerned. And the Enneagram, it's, the law of 3 and the law of 7. So the original teachings of the Enneagram have nothing to do with personality type. the Enneagram basically is a way to expand our consciousness. It gives us an understanding of who we are and how we operate, and that helps, make the change. I'll tell you, here's what happened. So my kids, now 40, son and a daughter, would come home and say, my friends can't find their type. So we got into a ritual of every time we had a family dinner, somebody would come along and we would do typing interviews.
Oh,
so
brilliant.
My partner Kathleen and I are both Enneagram trained by the narrative tradition, Helen Palmer and David Daniels. And for me, many others. But so we would start doing this. And then about the same time, I was also studying, I'd already known the Enneagram for many, many, many years, but I'd started studying spiral dynamics, the Gravian theory, not the integral theory. I started studying with Don Beck and got certified with Dr. Beck, who just recently died. And then I went on to study with Natasha Todorovic and Chris Cowan. And Chris is no longer with us. So Chris and Don knew, and Natasha knew Claire Graves. And so when I was studying with Don, I said, hey, my kids can't find themselves on the Enneagram. And he says, well, that's because it's not a great system. He didn't know the Enneagram very well, if at all. And so I started to pair them because I could see that most of the books that were out at the time and continue to this day, with, of course, I'll make a plug, with the exception of my 9 books, one for each type, that are avatar books that take you through each level of consciousness for each type. So anyway, the kids couldn't find themselves, and I started seeing that most of the books were written at blue or red, blue, orange. Sometimes 8s looked like they lived in red, hedonistic, pleasure-driven, bullies, that kind of stuff. Not true necessarily. So the books were written blue, red, blue, orange, mostly blue, tweaking with a little bit of orange and red, right? Well, these kids, this is the spiral is a problem-solving system. So, and it's cyclical. We, and then I, self-expressive or self-sacrificing. And so when I was born into blue. I think my kids were born into orange green because I'd solved the problems.
Yeah.
Their parents had solved the problems that arise in at each level of consciousness. So we had solved those problems, and they had a better life. They had a greater life, in a sense, because of where they came in. But the kids couldn't identify themselves in the books. So that was many, many, many years ago. And since then, many teachers teach typing, how to locate yourself in the Enneagram. For my purposes, I think the easiest, best way is just to look at the article that I sent you, and you can find yourself in the graph. It's a pretty simple graph, and with pretty specific ideas of what each type looks like at each level of consciousness. And so that's why I paired them, was because I really didn't resonate with how they wrote about 8s. I used to say to anybody who would listen, maybe I'm a 3, maybe I'm a 7, which is my tri-type 7-3-8, 8-7-3. But I didn't want to be an 8. And then people kept telling me, no, you're pretty much an 8. But what I read about didn't describe me as much as others did until I started doing this kind of work. So that's why I paired them. I also think don't get me wrong, they're both standalone systems. They don't need to be paired. A lot of things are paired with the Enneagram that make no sense to me. This made sense. And so I paired them because even though they're standalone systems, they certainly inform one another to a greater extent. Actually, how I got onto this was I was reading Ken Wilber's Integral Psychology. And I think it was on page 58 or something like that. He said, the Enneagram's a great tool, but it's flat. It's two-dimensional. And wouldn't it be great if somebody paired it with spiral dynamics? I'm like, hey, I know both of these systems pretty intricately, so I think I'll go do something with it. And that's how it all came about. But it had to do with my kids not being able to help their friends find their types.
Yeah, so like everything good, it came out of a need to solve a real problem, and it does. And I'm going to link to that article in the notes so that people can see it, because you did do this piece of research where you got people who knew their Enneagram types very well to describe themselves at each level.
Yes, that's right. So what I did was I went to an IEA conference. At the time, I was fairly new. My head hadn't expanded in its size yet until later. So I asked all these people, Helen Palmer, Don Riso, Russ, Peter O'Hanrahan, Judith Searle. I think Mona Coates was there. A lot of people. There were lots of people. And then Terry Saraceno. Then I broke them into type groups. Ones here, twos here, threes here. And they all knew the Enneagram extremely well. Well, I taught them the spiral like in 90 minutes. And then in the other 30 minutes, asked them to give me one word to describe their type at each level of consciousness, and then a phrase that describes their type at each level of consciousness. That was the beginning of the research. And I've just continued it I think I published that article that you have in 2010. So, and I've been studying it, God, for many years before that, both of them. So
there's something weird that happens by even studying those maps. So some sort of, I think is the word, psychoactive effect starts to take hold once you begin to see that these patterns could exist. Like the spiral, for me, that was such a big cognitive leap I had to make to really get on board with the idea that that was a thing. That's pulled me up in my development.
I agree 100%. When I started studying with Don, I already knew the Enneagram. I already had my school. So the School of Conscious Living was already in existence. But I was mesmerized by the work, and it just is beautiful how they dovetail together. No nails, no glues required. They just kind of fit pretty easily.
Give people an idea of how the spiral adds nuance to the type, or even just actually nuance to the development work of each type. Can you go through each level of the spiral, referencing where they harmonize with certain types, and then where there's more of a natural conflict between the type and the value system?
Well, it's not something I would do, actually. So what I would do, because part of the problem is that we want to make things certain. And so we hear things like, oh, orange is 3. Or you might hear, the orange meme represents 3, 8, and 7, the more assertive types. And that's not anything I would do. I think the way I look at it is, how does each type expand its consciousness? Not are these types more relevant at different levels of consciousness. So for me, all types are necessary, and all levels of consciousness are equally necessary. Type is expressed differently at each level of consciousness, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
So I wouldn't say, oh, all, and this is in part kind of what happened in the early writings. They weren't talking about the spiral, but all 6s are blue. I wouldn't say that. I would say 6s have the capacity to be blue, orange, green, yellow, turquoise. That's what I would say. So that's different than, Rez, have you heard people say, oh, England is type 5, US is type 3?
I have. You know what I'm getting to with this? Like, I've definitely noticed with me, there's certain things about green values and blue values, actually any of the collective levels, any of the we levels, that just piss me off more. And so what I've wondered is whether my type has me get out of them as quickly as possible and have a ton of what's the word I've heard for this? Developmental allergy or allergies in those levels. Is that a possibility?
It's for all intents and purposes, I say that it takes 7 years to get out of a situation. Now there are traumas. I was on a board once that I swear to God, I thought I was going to kill myself because it was all consensus thinking, and I'm not a consensus thinker, probably like you. Our types make us a little different in the way we think. And so I thought, oh my God. So I stayed on that board for about 6 years. And by the time I got off of it, I can tell you I was no longer in green because it was like, So I have a tendency, and we do have a tendency, and this could be type related, but I'm not 100% sure, to be more I than we. So you can see that the more assertive types, 7, 8, and 3, might appear to be more self-expressive on the surface and less self-sacrificing. Now, remember, though, this is a transcend and include system. So if you're in blue or green and you're pissed off and you project yourself for somehow to grow into yellow, which is I say yellow is I/we, turquoise is we/I. It's all about the collective in the second tier. Do no harm, all for the good of all kind of thing, if you will. So we can try to make some stuff up, but I don't have any real data on it, which types are I and which types are we. And it's a transcend and include system was what I was saying. And what that means is if you have developed to green, you have beige, purple, red, blue, orange running through you. So it's transcendent. You've already brought all of those values with you. They either are integrated or they're being used to help you understand other people. Like in my consulting and corporations, I mean, knowing the Enneagram and the spiral helps me speak to their listening. So I can get my point across much, more fluidly with them. And so that's why it's a good system, but it's a transcend and include. So even though the we upsets you and you want to move into the I, you can only do that after about 7 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anyway, I've made it this interview about me and my circumstances, which is not unusual for me to do. But all right, a different question then, Deborah. So what would someone in blue, orange, green, and yellow, how would they see a map like the Enneagram?
Okay, so in blue, actually, remember, blue came on board about 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. So let's say 10,000 years ago, they would see it as the tools of, Satan. Might as well be called pentagram rather than Enneagram. And I think actually at one point, I think it was, what was his name? Blanking on his name, but he wrote an article for the Pope denouncing the Enneagram. And I think that was in the 80s or 90s. It's out there, and said that it was not a tool that we should study. So when we think of blue, we think of traditional things, traditional schooling, traditional religions, traditional, education, money, all of those things, government, military. Those are some of the things that we think of, the traditional stuff. So what was your question? What would somebody in blue,
how would they see the Enneagram?
They would see it as suspect. It's sort of like, wait a minute, next thing you're going to be talking to me about astrology, or tarot. Oh my God, that kind of thing. So they might see it with a little skepticism, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Because the traditional values, actually, I go into organizations where, like Toyota, for instance, or Procter and Gamble, where people opt out of being typed because it's against their religion. Because it's the Enneagram, when you Google it, all kinds of crazy stuff comes up, but people can see it as a religious system, and it isn't, but people can see it as that. And why do they see it that way? Because they live in blue. So they're going to see it as a system that is hierarchical. So 9 must be better than 1, or does it go backwards? So blue is going to look at it a little differently. Orange is going to look at it as, how can this serve me? How can the Enneagram help me to get to where I want to go quicker, faster, more efficiently, better? So you can hear almost the 3-ness in that, right?
For sure.
So it's about playing the game to win. And
Mm.
so if this tool, the Enneagram, can help me know somebody better and help me speak to their listening better or get one up on them, I'm going to use that tool. So remember, orange is about multiplistic thinking, right?
Mhm.
It's going to use it to gain, is the way I would say it. Use it to gain. A lot of times we get into trouble, like when the Enneagram first started getting great, all of these teachers start going out making their living on it, right? And then when we teach another country, then that country starts making their living off of the Enneagram kind of thing. And those are orange conceptualizations.
Mm.
How do I take a system and make a living from it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In green, so green turned on about 150 years ago. Orange turned on 300 years ago. And so green is sort of, all are welcome here. We've kind of made our money. We've achieved the material success as defined by us. We define it in orange and green. And so we're kind of, we can go on cruise if we want. So we find a lot of people who have risen to green, studying all kinds of stuff like, spiral dynamics, the Enneagram, Barrett's value systems, nonviolent communication. I could go down the list of everything that I've looked at. And so, but we have enough money to do that. And so we see it, I think, this is not the truth, but I think in green, many of us in our development have seen it as a way to help with our psycho-spiritual connection and evolution. Mm-hmm. So I think we see it as another way to, get to wherever we're going in green. And in green, we're open to just about anything, as long as it's not out of bounds with our values. When we get into yellow, we're talking a whole different ball game here. Okay, so it's a whole new world order. It's like starting over again. It's like starting, if you want to think of it this way, think of it as purple is yellow, because beige is always present. Beige is integrated into us. Mm-hmm. So when we get to yellow, it's a whole new world order. We're going to think about things in a different way. And like I said, this came on board, by the way, about 50 years ago, 55, something like that.
Very new.
And we're going to see things from what I say, a collective individuality. We're going to see things with our left brain and feelings. So we're going to see things paradoxically. Yeah. So what I say, and you can edit this out if you want, I don't care. But what I say is the Enneagram is the greatest thing I've ever met in my life. And it's a piece of shit. Because, sorry.
I'm definitely not editing that out. That's staying in.
Well, because from my perspective, this is paradox, right?
Yeah.
So I see things paradoxically, which is, okay, it's good. It has a lot of value, but I have seen it misused so much. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's like, okay. In my school, I used to certify coaches, but I don't anymore because I got so disillusioned with how people could misuse, these systems, my own students kind of thing. So
I can understand the frustration. I didn't know that you'd stopped doing that, putting the coaches, teaching the coaches spiral and the.
I still teach it. I still teach it coaching, and I still have the school, and I do most of it online or in person, like in Cairo or Seoul or wherever. But I just quit certifying. Now I certify Enneagram teachers still, Enneagram teachers and trainers. So the school certifies, yeah.
Yeah. I expect you'll be able to deal with this quite quickly, Deborah, but Riso's levels, which you call them health, right? His levels of health. Where do they fit in with this?
Yeah. Yes, I have about a 300 slide deck. I'm trying to figure out how to put it together in a way that makes sense, because I love Russ's levels of development and Don's levels of development, and it's about health and wholeness. Yeah. So if you take the 9 levels of health and wholeness you would put them at each level of the spiral. And you would put them at each level of the spiral. And this is why the PowerPoint is so darn big. At each level of spiral in their correct level of health. So I think one is the highest level for that. Yeah. One is the highest level. And that would not be a healthy place to be if you were in red meme. Yeah. The healthiest level for red meme, like I think of type 1. If you look at type 1 and you put type 1 at level 7, they may survive in the red meme, because in the red meme, it's two types of people, perpetrators and victims. And so, you know, you're not going to want to be like, you know, oh, hi, kumbaya. Can I just give you a hug? I see that you have a knife and that you want to cut my throat, but what if we just kind of stare at each other for a couple of minutes and see if we can move this energy? You see what I'm saying? So it would be, you'd be dead before you finish that sentence. So that's kind of the funny way to think about it. So that's what I'm doing. So each level of consciousness has a different health level. A healthy one is going to look like this. Yeah. You know, a healthy 8 is going to look like this. But those are written, and by the way, Russ was in this class with me, but he also already knows the spiral. And he, you know, and he's well versed in it. So I know that he could see that if he were in purple as a 5, it wouldn't be healthy if he were at level 1. So you see what I'm saying?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
I got it.
So yeah, it's complex. That's why there's 300 slides, and I'm trying to figure out what to do, how to put it together, because I love systems, but sometimes you can expand it to the point where it just makes your head swim. It makes no damn sense.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm trying to figure out if this is going to make any sense. But you know what? This is the question that everyone asks me on podcasts. Yeah. How do they match? How do they match?
They match. Yeah.
So I'm working on it. I'll tell you when I get there.
Oh, that's exciting. That's exciting. So the slides, will that become an article, or what will that become? You don't know how you're going to teach that yet.
Somebody will say, hey, can you teach this? And I'll say, sure, that's how it'll happen. And you may know this about me, but most of my material is available. Yeah. So if you take a class with me, you know, or if you know somebody, you get, you know, 500 pages of material from me. You get my PowerPoints, you get all my stuff. And so, because it's not mine. Yeah. It's not mine. It's not. I actually say I'm into R&D, ripping off and duplicating, which is what we all do, right? We all are taking somebody's knowledge and bringing it and tweaking it a bit. It's a system handed to us from, I'll say, the gods, you know, and you can see it in Egypt and just about everywhere you go. You can feel the energy, you know. Yeah. I just would love to hear how you got into the 4th way as a spiritual path. And at what point that came online? Was it before you got into the Enneagram and spiral? And also, I'd love to hear what consciousness you think those teachings are a product of. Like Gurdjieff, I'm imagining, had to have been way up on the spiral. Yeah. So when I was a young child, here, go through my analysis here. When I was younger, my father became born again Christian. I come from a Native American tradition, and he became born again, which was just crazy land as far as I was concerned. But I went to church, you know, on Saturdays, Sundays, Wednesdays, you know, I was a good, sort of kind of good girl, but not really. And I started going to the library and looking up esoteric teachings. I was about 13. And I found like Madame Blavatsky, or, you know, this is Theosophy is how my initial beginning into it. And then Aleister Crowley, people who, you know, Anton LaVey, he wrote the Satan Bible kind of thing. So I started reading that kind of stuff. And then I have a habit of doing this. I look at bibliographies and then I take it where it seems interesting. And Gurdjieff's writings were in different places, or he was referenced. And so I started picking up anything I could on Gurdjieff. And then I, researched fourth way groups in my area and that kind of stuff, which never really felt okay to me because they were static and that was not the way Gurdjieff taught. I got really involved with, and I have a close circle of friends who live the life and have lived the life for many, many, many years. And so, we sort of teach one another. I think Russ had some time with Madame de Salzman and a couple of other teachers, and I've had a number of teachers as well. Mm. And so, you generally hook up with a teacher and or group, mm-hmm. and find your way that way. It didn't start becoming okay to talk about it until maybe 10 years ago, maybe even less than that. Wow. So we didn't go around and saying, hey, I'm in the fourth way. Are you a fourth way student? We didn't do that. It's not like we just didn't do it. Mm-hmm. Deeds. Yeah. How we appeared in the world gave others information. And the way we thought about things, I think, has been affected. Gurdjieff did not know spiral dynamics. And yet, at the same time, he constantly talked about levels of consciousness. So Claire Graves didn't bring what we know today as spiral dynamics on board until the 1950. Mm-hmm. So, Gurdjieff was dead by then. And mm-hmm. so we know from all of his teachings, from Sir Nichols' teachings, from J.G. Bennett's teachings, Orridge, we could go on and on. Catherine Mansfield, all of these different authors, we know that he was always talking about levels of consciousness. Mm-hmm. There's actually an excerpt in Peter, whatever I can't say his last name. I can't remember. Oh yeah, he begins with a B. Yeah. His book on Gurdjieff. It shows it is so clearly showing memetics. And yet they don't talk about it. So there's this example where a young, I think it's Uffizi child is captured in a circle. Mm. So he has a belief that if he gets to the edge of the circle, he starts writhing in pain. Mm. And so there are a bunch of kids on the outside of the circle saying, trying to get him to come out because they think it's hysterical, right? Well, that child obviously lived in purple meme, and he had a belief that if he got, encaptured by the circle, that it would kill him. And so Gurdjieff simply walked over as a young man, took his foot and rubbed the circle out, and the kid ran away. And there's several examples in that movie where you can see memes being, at one point he needed money for his journey to continue on his journeys. And so they captured just normal, regular sparrows or something like that. And they painted them exotic colors like blue and yellow and sold them and got money. Well, that's more of an orangish kind of meme. So you can see different levels appearing in that movie. I think it's interesting. And consciousness can be a number of different things. Can mean a number of different things. Consciousness I think Gurdjieff was about expanding our awareness, and he frequently utilized the rays of creation, the 7 rays of creation, and the Enneagram to help us on our journey. And so consciousness here in the spiral is cognitive complexity. That's consciousness. Consciousness for Gurdjieff was psychospiritual in nature. Mm-hmm. What are the truths in the universe, and how do I develop? How do I expand my awareness?
He's responsible for so much, isn't he? I just can't. The fact that you were scrapping around in libraries at 13, just classic example of the life conditions not being such that you had to solve a problem. You had a big problem on your hands.
Perfect. That's the key here. The problem was I did not think of God the way Southern Free Will Baptist ministers taught about God. I thought about God the way my native ancestors taught about gods, basically, the energies, earth, wind, air, fire, that kind of thing. And I thought about things from a different perspective, not like a deity outside of myself. I kind of thought I was kind of one with. And so the problem here, what happens in the spiral that moves you, is when your thinking is not congruent with your life conditions. Remember those life conditions? And then the thinking. Well, here's my life conditions. I'm 13. I live with a bunch of crazy people who, think speaking in tongues and snakes are okay. And, I'm like, no, this doesn't work for me. So I found a way, which was, through sports and educating myself in libraries. One of my favorite possessions was my library card. And so I still have it. It's interesting. So I couldn't be here. It makes me suffer. So when there's not congruence between your level of consciousness and your circumstances, you're going to suffer.
Yeah.
And that's what makes us move.
I'm going to say thank you for your time, Deborah. This has been so good. I really liked it a lot.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
The next interview is with Dominic Lieber, and it's about inquiry or inquiry, which I'm super excited about.